Hi, my name is Jean-Luc Pilon, and for over 33 years I was a curator of archaeology at the Canadian Museum of History. In 2015, Randy Boswell, a Carleton University journalism professor with a very strong interest in history, and we wrote an article that described the ancient history of the centers of Ottawa and Gatineau. Now this year, the Ottawa Chapter of the Ontario Archaeological Society is hosting a virtual Ontario Archaeological Symposium. Now if you had come here in the fall, I would probably have taken you on a visit of a lot of those sites that Randy and I described in our article. But unfortunately it's virtual, but I thought that nonetheless I could still give you a visit or a flavor for what some of those sites are. And I thought that the best way to do it would be to do it from the water's surface in my canoe. In fact, that's a perspective that you will share with the people who lived along this river for thousands of years in ancient times. And it's a perspective that's really quite different from what you would get if you took a bus tour or if you strolled along the streets of the cities of Ottawa and Gatineau. And there's one thing that I want to stress, is that what I'm going to be presenting in this virtual tour is my perspective on the ancient past. I have selected some sites. There are probably others that could have been included. I am selecting the information that helps me tell a story, while there's a lot more that could be told. If I had access to traditional knowledge or traditional histories of the region, that would certainly greatly enhance that story, but I don't. So it is my view on that past that I want to share with you today. So let's go down to the river's edge and let's get going. We're at the mouth of the Gatineau River, and on the east side of the river, at Point Gatineau, right to the left of that two-story brown building with the big veranda, is where in 2014 Daniel Chevrier excavated an archaeological site. Now the discovery was quite accidental. Hydro-Quebec was going to be doing some land management of a piece of property on Jacques Cartier Street. And they found archaeological remains, brought in an archaeologist because it had been assessed. And what he found there was a series of occupations, a number of hearth features and material that was associated with it. And the oldest radiocarbon date is on the order of 7,300 years. So that makes it one of the oldest sites, certainly in this corridor, but also one of the oldest sites in the National Capital Area. There's just perhaps one other site that was found in South Ottawa. In 1916, a farmer picked up an arrowhead or projectile point. Eventually it was brought to the museum, and it appears to be on the order of 8,000 to 9,000 years old. It's a St. Charles point, a very distinctive kind of point that would be from the earliest inhabitants. But nonetheless, Point Gatineau, Jacques Cartier Street is the oldest in this corridor, and that sort of sets the benchmark for when people first came here. And it's interesting because the materials that were found at that site suggest strong connections with areas to the south. Raw materials are coming into the area that these people are bringing with them that suggest that maybe they are a group who had just learned about or were starting to establish themselves in the Ottawa Valley and in the Ottawa area, and didn't quite know what the sources of materials were, and kept their strong connections with their friends and families in areas further to the south. So that's the beginning of the story. Today it's a park. The decision was made to commemorate that site because of its significance in the local history and its significance, of course, to Indigenous people and the Indigenous presence in the Ottawa Valley. The story goes that in 1992, Marcel Laliberté, a consulting archaeologist, was on vacation in the Gatineau area. He rented a bicycle and went for a ride in Limy Lake Park. Limy Lake Park is a large National Capital Commission park, a natural park at the mouth of the Gatineau River. Many, many acres. And, well, Marcel was a smoker. At one point he stopped at the side of the water to have a smoke. As archaeologists are wont to do, he's looking down at the ground and he starts to see bits and pieces of chipped stone, maybe a piece of pottery or two. Long story short, he eventually turned this into a project that lasted over 10 years, where he identified at least 16 pre-contact archaeological sites. Many, if not most of these sites are multi-component, because Limy Lake Park at the mouth of the Gatineau River is a delta that has been forming for thousands of years. And every now and then you get a particularly high spring flood, deposition of sand and silt, new surface for people to live on. It is built up like that. In some cases it's over 1 meter of deposits. And so this Limy Lake Park is like an island that has survived in the heart of the National Capital Region. And it has such a story to tell us about the rich use of the area and the rich resources that the area represented for Indigenous peoples for thousands of years. In 1898, Gertrude Kenny, a local historian, recounted how this place near the mouth of the Gatineau River, the Ottawa, and the Rideau River was a place that people would come in pre-contact times to trade and exchange produce from their regions. So we would have birch bark coming into the area, we would have birch bark canoes, we would have agricultural products, we would have tobacco. And archaeologically, we know that there's also stone that was an important commodity being traded and exchanged in this region. So this area, Limy Lake Park, the Anishinaabe Algonquin from Kitigan-Zibi gave it the name Kabeshinan, a gathering place. And it reflects the fact that archaeologically we found evidence of people coming to trade, for example, in stone. We find exotic stones coming from as far away as the tip of Labrador, central Quebec, the Hudson's Bay lowlands, the western end of Lake Ontario, and it all comes together here. There's even a local rock called Kichisibi Chert. It's not a high quality, but it is present in abundance and was used very extensively in this region and probably traded as well. So I've decided to stop at one of the Limy Lake sites. It's a site that has been worked on by Marcel Laliberté, Ian Badgley from the National Capital Commission. I worked a little bit here in 2002. And I wanted to show something very important in understanding the archaeology of the sites in Limy Lake Park. And that's the erosion. You can see that this face of the terrace here has been chewed away. Roots have been exposed, fresh soil has been exposed, and what that does is it also washes away the archaeological sites. Now others can tell you a lot more about that, but one of the reasons for that, this is a delta, it should be building out every few years, but instead, since they built the Carillon Dam about 70 miles downstream from here, the water levels have been maintained during the summertime, when normally they would have gone way down. And all of the storms, the summer storm activity would have been beating up the beach sands. Now they are kept artificially high, the water levels, and those storms come and chew away at these deposits. And so they've been exposing archaeological sites and destroying archaeological sites. More of the late woodland is very poorly represented in this region in the Limy Lake Park, probably because it's all been washed away. And we just get little dribs and drabs of it. Mostly we find a lot of middle woodland, different periods within the middle woodland, and some late archaic. but that is all due to the very, very significant erosion that has been taking place in the last 50 years. So when I was working here in 2002, a visitor, local from Gatineau, came visiting one day, and he was sharing with us a story about how when he was a young man, he would play baseball. Him and his friends would play baseball between that island and the mainland. Now, how could you play baseball there today? Absolutely impossible. And that was due to the fact that the Carillon Dam wasn't built yet. The summer levels of the Ottawa River were much lower than what they are today, and it would expose sand deposits, and it would create a playground for young people to play baseball. The beauty of Lemhi Lake Park for me is not only the archaeological story that is told in the ground here, but also the area itself. You can basically see a region that is as pristine as you're going to get in terms of representing a natural wild habitat as it would have evolved over thousands of years. And so right in the heart of Ottawa, we can come here and we can really travel in time and be in a century well before the disruptions that occurred in this region. So it's a beautiful spot just in terms of the natural features and the natural landscapes that exist here. In June of 1613, Samuel de Champlain came up the Ottawa River, and he passed in front of the Rideau Falls. And here's what he had to say about it. He says, where this river, the Gatineau, has its débouchure, is another one coming from the south, at the mouth of which is a marvelous fall. For it descends a height of 20 or 25 fathoms, with such impetuosity that it makes an arc nearly 400 paces broad. The people take pleasure in passing under it, not getting wet, except from the spray that is thrown off. There's an island in the middle of the river, which, like the country around it, is covered with pines and white cedars. When the people desire to enter the river, they ascend the mountain, carrying their canoes, and go half a league by land. The neighboring country is filled with all sorts of game, so that the people often make a stop here. So that's one of the earliest descriptions of this area, and it's a description of the richness and the interest that the area held. So the confluence of the Rideau River, the Gatineau River, and the Ottawa was a very, very important hub for people to meet during the warm weather period in the summertime. But how do you get from the Rideau River to the Ottawa, given that you've got these steep cliffs all over the place? Well, there are two places that have been identified as likely portage routes. One lies right in front of 24 Sussex, the home of the Prime Minister of Canada. It's called Governor's Bay. It's a place that people came in the 19th century to quarry stone to build a lot of the mansions that we see in the neighborhood of Rockcliffe. But it's also on the beaches there that objects have been found dating to about 2,500 years ago, and where, importantly, the angle of the slope is much gentler, and that people could, in fact, go up on top of the plateau. A second location is a little further downstream, across a major promontory, but in a deep embayment that I've given the name of Portage Bay to. In the back of that beach, a couple archaeological sites were found. One of them has material that is probably late Archaic. And at that place, there are nice sand deposits that fill the embayment and allow you to easily walk up the slope on top of the plateau to then walk all the way to the Rideau River, which would be about a half a kilometer or a kilometer away. So we're at the eastern end of Jacques Cartier Park. Museum is way over at the other end. We're at the mouth of Brewery Creek as well. And so we've just walked up from the Ottawa River. Now behind me, you can see a two-story stone building. In 1860, Edward Haycock, who was involved in the construction of the Parliament buildings, lived there. And he was installing a summer kitchen off of the house. He's digging the foundations and he starts to find what Edwin Souter described as ash pits. So there was some kind of a hearth feature, and there was ceramics associated with that hearth feature. Now Edwin Souter in 1895, wasn't a ceramic specialist, and he compared those ceramics to ceramics that had been found in southern Ontario. And he suggested that, maybe they were Huron pottery. More than likely, though, they were Middle Woodland pottery, probably on the order of 2,000, 1,500 years old. In the 1980s, this is an interesting little aside, Roger Marois, who was the Quebec archaeologist at the time at the Museum of Civilization, I think it was called then, came to this area to try to relocate evidence of that occupation that Haycock would have encountered and that Souter told us about. And we did some excavations in this area here in Jacques Cartier Park, and several feet down he started to find very large pieces of architectural stone that has been carved, and more than likely the remains of the cathedral in Hull, which had burnt in the 1970s, had been demolished, and they had to do something with all of that massive stone, and they seem to have used it as landfill here. So the whereabouts of that site still remains unknown, but it's an important anchor to show us that all of Jacques Cartier Park has a continuous occupation all along its length. So a few years ago, 5-6 years ago, the NCC was doing some work here. I don't know, maybe this mound has something to do with it. And Ian Badgley was overseeing the construction work because they were exposing buried soils, but they never found anything. They might have been beside it, they might have been destroyed, who knows. We stopped here in the middle of Jacques Cartier Park. That's the Charon house behind me. Maison Charon was built in the early 1830s and really relates to the early history of Gatineau. Now, Jacques Cartier Park is a long NCC, National Capital Commission park that stretches from the mouth of Brewery Creek in this direction to the Canadian Museum of History, which is just over here. In the middle 19th century, there were big lumber yards here at the Brewery Creek end. There was a bit of an industrial area in behind of us. But my reason for stopping here was that a few years ago I was working with some cadets and we were doing some shoreline cleanup in Jacques Cartier Park. And as we went along, I started to find artifacts along the beach. And in fact, whenever the National Capital Commission does work in the park, whether it's putting in a monument or straightening or widening a path, they always send in an archaeologist ahead of time because invariably they're going to be finding artifacts. Now, a lot of those artifacts relate to the Middle Woodland period, 1500, 2000 years ago, 2500 years ago. And a lot of their work is always restrained by the footprint of the project that they're doing. So we don't have a good idea of the complexity, but we do know that it's sort of all over the place in this park. So the importance of this place and the significance is if you look at the slope and the lay of the land, it's a very agreeable place to stop when you're canoeing up the Ottawa River. There's gentle slopes, it's a relatively sandy beach, and there's nice surfaces and terraces on which you can set up your camp. And we know that the area was rich in resources. So that explains why this whole area on the north side of the Ottawa River has been used in ancient times. So several years ago, the National Capital Commission wanted to commemorate the fact that the Ottawa River here was a very important trade route in pre-contact times. And so they came to the museum and they asked for examples of items that reflected the long-distance trade network. And so there's two pieces that I identified. One is this very large biface that is made of a stone that comes from Illinois. And it was found on Morrison Island in the 1960s. And the second item that I identified was a bracelet made of native copper. And that native copper comes from the western end of Lake Superior. So these are two excellent examples of very, very long distance trade, of which the Ottawa Valley was an important route or part of a network. We're in the embayment in front of the Canadian Museum of History. Now, a lot of history, a lot of ancient history took place right behind us. But there's been so much change to the landscape that it's really hard to be able to see it. But luckily, over the last century and a half, a number of people observed things, saw things, gathered things, and preserved that information and published it, and it's accessible. And when we started to put the pieces all together, it became obvious that this place at the Museum of History is very significant in terms of the ancient history of that corridor that goes from the Gatineau River to the Chaudière Falls. In fact, it's probably even more significant in a whole regional scheme. So we're going to get off, walk up onto the land, and look at some of those bits and pieces. One of the first things that we need to talk about when we look at this landscape and try to figure out its importance in the local scheme of things is how the landscape itself has changed. Right now you've got a nice embayment, a point that advances into the Ottawa River, and then the shoreline that heads up towards the Chaudière Falls. There's a series of historical maps from the 19th century and into the 20th century that I've overlain, and I can see how that shoreline has changed. Now, the part that is along the side of the Ottawa River is more or less the same over the last 200 years. But the embayment in front of the museum has changed radically. There's been a lot of infilling. So basically, where that green patch is on this side of the pathway, that is more or less somewhere in there where the edge of the river used to be. So now you can see how much it is a really deep embayment. And that's important because that point is deflecting the strong currents that are coming down from the Chaudière Falls, which is just about a kilometer and a half away. And you can see off the end of the point how the waters are turbulent, strong currents there. In fact, this is something that you can see really well in the springtime when the river ice is starting to break up and to melt. The embayment here will remain solid ice covered until very, very late, while right off the point you'll start to get a channel open up in the ice and it'll break up and melt. So that's an important consideration when you are on the river and you're traveling up the Ottawa River. You're going to have to think about where you're going to start the portage to go around the Chaudière Falls. With the nice sand deposits, these were nice sandy beaches in here, with the currents that are being deflected and the nice still waters, this is the ideal place to get out of your canoe and to begin that portage around the Chaudière Falls. In fact, we see this on an early 19th century map, sketch map of this area. There's a trail that begins here and goes up around the falls. In the early 19th century, before they built the first bridge that crosses the Ottawa River here in Ottawa-Gatineau, there was a ferry that would come from the mouth of the Rideau Canal and come right across here to that point. Now, today there is the tugboat, the Missinaibi, which for those of you who know and recognize the dollar bills of a few years ago, it was pulling some pulpwood on the Ottawa River. But where that tugboat is used to be Bedard's Hotel. Jean Bedard had a hotel and he ran the ferry service between Ottawa and Hull. So this point used to be called Bedard's Landing. There was a wharf, there was a warehouse, there was Jean Bedard's hotel. And this hotel has been illustrated in the 19th century in a number of places. Well, in 1843, they were building the first bridge across the Ottawa River, and they needed sand to make the mortar. And they came to a place below the Chaudière Falls, about 3/4 of a mile, and they started to extract sand from a sand deposit. Dr. Edward Van Cortlandt, who was a medical doctor in the early 19th century, early mid-19th century in Ottawa, was very interested in history, human history, natural history, whatever. And the workmen who were digging the sand started to find human remains. They knew that they were quite old, so they informed Dr. Van Cortlandt, who came here, and they allowed him 2 days of digging. And he found the equivalent of perhaps 20 or so individuals. 10 years later, he wrote a short article that was published in the Canadian Journal. And that was the first archaeological find that has been published or is known in the Ottawa-Hull area. And that happened somewhere, as he told us, behind Bedard's Hotel. Now, if you have a hotel where that tugboat is, I defy you to tell me where behind Bedard's Hotel is. It's a question of perspective. If you are on the water or in Ottawa, behind could be where we are right now, where the sand beaches used to be. Or it could be behind to the right of the tugboat. We don't know how far from Bedard's Hotel. So this whole area in here is where Van Cortlandt found the burial place. And the burial place seems to exhibit characteristics and different types of burials that probably span at least 4,000 years. Now, what happened to Dr. Edward Van Cortlandt's collection is not known. As far as we know, all of that material is long since gone. The only thing that we can attribute to Dr. Edward Van Cortlandt and this location, Bedard's Landing, is found at the McCord Museum in Montreal, where there are half a dozen bone tools that were found, and one of them has, and they're attributed to Dr. Van Cortlandt, and one of them has written right on it, Bedard's Landing, Hull, 1866, which tells us two things. One, bone artifacts were being well preserved, and two, Dr. Van Cortlandt came back here more than once to collect materials. Edwin Souter was an amateur archaeologist, amateur paleontologist, who lived in Aylmer, just upstream from Ottawa. And he recounted that in the 1860s, when they were building the Houses of Parliament, they needed, once again, sand to make mortar to build those stone buildings. And they came across the river from Parliament Hill, just north of the Alexandra Bridge, where there are great sand deposits. And we know that from Van Cortlandt's burial place work a little earlier near Bedard's Landing. So they came to this embayment to gather sand. And Van Cortlandt, or Souter, was told that in the 1860s they're finding all kinds of artifacts relating to the pre-contact people. They're finding pottery, they're finding stone arrowheads, stone axes. And so it's telling us that this was an area known for having been used in pre-contact times by Indigenous people. In fact, you can look at some artwork done in the early 1800s. In 1832, when they finished building the Rideau Canal, one engineer, Henry Pooley, Lieutenant Henry Pooley, was particularly artful and artistic, and he drew a watercolor that is today at the National Gallery of Canada. But he came to this side of the river, and his watercolor is titled The Mouth of the Rideau Canal. But he has a little bit of the shoreline that he's standing on or sitting on to do his painting. And he's got an Indigenous family there. There's a tent, a family around a campfire. And you have to ask yourself if he'd included that because, again, the knowledge that people would find objects here in this very location over a long period of time. About, I'm just going to estimate maybe 15 years ago, a local artist, Jeremy Giles, created a statue of Samuel de Champlain in bronze that was in downtown Hull here for many years. It's now going to be moved to the new ZB development so that it is closer to the river. Now, Jeremy Giles felt that this was unbalanced, only having a statue and a commemoration of Samuel de Champlain. We already had one across the river beside the National Gallery, and he wanted to see a commemoration of an Anishinaabe Algonquin. And so he created this statue of Teshuat. Teshuat was, there was an Algonquin Anishinaabe chief by the name of Teshuat that was met by Samuel de Champlain in 1613, probably at Morrison Island near Pembroke. The name was also passed on to at least one or two other Algonquin Anishinaabe chiefs in the 17th century. It's a representation of somebody that has been given the name Teshuat, but the important thing is that this person, for the first time in the history of this place, Ottawa-Gatineau, we are commemorating in a very real way the presence of the Anishinaabe Algonquin. In November of 2017, this beautiful statue of Teshuat was unveiled and revealed in this location that had so much real significance for the Anishinaabe Algonquin people for thousands of years. This was a place where they would come and meet in the summertime. This was a place where they would begin the portage around the sacred falls. This was a place where they left their ancestors, their dead, so that they could come and rekindle a relationship with them every time they were coming up or down the river. And for the first time, in November of 2017, for the first time in probably 2 or 3 centuries, if not more, Anishinaabe Algonquin dancers and drummers performed and celebrated this place and this man and everything that he represents. So we've come up from the Museum of History. Currents, as you can see, are a little strong, so I walked. Two places I want to point out on the other side of the river here. One is the Supreme Court of Canada building. And the Supreme Court of Canada building in itself is not important, except that in 1917, a person from Ottawa found a pipe bowl, a stone pipe bowl, and donated it to the Museum of History, what is today the Museum of History. And it was found something like 250 feet west of Bank Street and 75 feet north of Wellington. Get out a map, that puts you in the front yard of the Supreme Court of Canada. And finding a pipe bowl there has perhaps no real significance. It's a pre-contact pipe bowl, but as we know, pipes and tobacco are associated with special ceremonies. 1852, somewhere in the vicinity of Bay and Wellington, they're building a house. And of course, because you can see that there's very little soil on top of the stone bedrock across the river, you have to quarry to make a foundation. Workmen were doing that, and at their lunch break, they went to the edge of the precipice of the cliffs to have their lunch. And in one of the crevices, and you can see that there are plenty of crevices in the bedrock there, they found human remains. They found the equivalent of 8 people inserted into the crevice. So it's interesting that when we look at those discoveries that were made on the Ottawa side of the river, pipe bowl, a crevice with human remains, I look at those and I look at them in relation to the Chaudière Falls. If you are behind Library and Archives Canada, which is more or less at Bay in Wellington, and you're at the edge of the cliff overlooking the river, you're looking directly at Chaudière Falls. And without all of this urban noise to pollute things, you would have heard them and felt the strength of that place. And so I think there's more than a coincidence that those things were located there, that the Museum of History, that there was a burial ground there, because it would have been in proximity to this place of power that is the Chaudière Falls. So here we are at one end of that important corridor that we visited. It goes from the Gatineau River to the Chaudière Falls. It's really hard to imagine what this whole area would have looked like in 1613 when Samuel de Champlain came through here and gave us a first description. There's so much cement around, the dam has narrowed and reduced the size of the falls themselves. The noise that we hear today, the jackhammer, the steel jaws, the motors, they would have been replaced by the roar of the falls, by the roar of the free falls, which would have been something that was a constant when you were in the area surrounding the falls. Places like this falls, are places of power. And we know that because in 1613, Champlain went first up as far as Pembroke, and then came down, and when he stopped on his way down, the people who were guiding him up the river held a tobacco ceremony at these falls. Now, tobacco is a sacred plant. Tobacco is a plant that is used in ceremonies to bring messages to another dimension of reality. And what took place here is that everybody contributed a little bit of tobacco to a plate. Words were spoken, words were sung. The tobacco offering was imbued with a message. And then the tobacco was offered to the entity, the spirit that inhabits these falls. Now, I think it was Elder William Commanda told us about the falls, that it's not just the falls itself which is a special place, but the whole area surrounding the falls. This entity, this power that was being respected by the men that accompanied Champlain, occupies this whole area. So it's no surprise that people would pay a special attention and make a special offering to that entity. This was a way Champlain was told, and we have to always ask ourselves, what was the quality of his Algonquin? How good was the translation that he was receiving? But he was told that those offerings were necessary whenever anybody traveled on the river in order to guarantee a safe passage. We have visited 9 locations between the mouth of the Gatineau River and the Chaudière Falls. And each one of these is a unique piece in a big puzzle. And each one is complementary to the other. They combine to create something that is more important than just the sum of the parts. And that's why Randy Boswell and I decided to refer to this corridor from Gatineau River to the Chaudière Falls as a cultural landscape. These locations had lots of time depth to them. So at any one time, people might have been using, for example, the campsites at the mouth of the Gatineau River to meet people from different parts of the continent, but they also might have been coming at the same time to visit their ancestors who were buried near the Museum of History, or visiting the Chaudière Falls to make the required and requisite offerings. And the big anchor, we believe, in that story is the Chaudière Falls and the notion that there are powerful entities that lived or resided there. This is why, for example, at the Museum of History, people brought their ancestors and their dead at a place where they knew they would be in proximity to that source of power. So, if anything, I hope that this tour has allowed you to see this landscape of the Ottawa-Gatineau National Capital Area with different eyes. See it in a different way. And so the next time that you hear a land acknowledgement that is quite often said at public events that recognizes the ancient relationship and bonds with the land between the Anishinaabe Algonquin and this landscape, that some of the places here, some of the images that I've shared with you will come to mind and will give texture and real meaning to those statements. Thanks for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. At the end of an odyssey. We've been 4 outings, all sorts of multiple takes, video taken, place is seen, and my Kakut's been with me all along. We've had a wonderful time. Thank you very much.